The sad story of a princess heir who was abandoned and cast aside by her family. Living in an orphanage made her suffer even more. In order to earn extra money, a girl named Lysol was willing to work part-time in a performance show. On that day, she was chosen to wear a princess costume, and it was then that she met a handsome diplomat named Hyun. To welcome important guests from foreign countries, Hyun persuaded Lysol to keep wearing the royal gown and promised to pay her a fee of $100. This made Lysol furious, and she kept following him everywhere to ensure that Hyun would truly pay her back. It turns out that in the past, Hyun's grandfather was a trusted person of the royal family. He was often given the mandate to find the descendants of Emperor Sunyoung. He pleaded with his grandson to urgently and as quickly as possible find a girl named Lysol and bring her before the grandfather. One day, as his grandfather had instructed, Hyun hurried to find Lysol's residence. Initially, he visited his friend's house, but he didn't find her there because Lysol was now living with her mother. Upon arriving at the intended address, Hyun was truly astonished to see that the girl, who had been following him the other day, was actually Lysol, the one his grandfather was searching for. He was so furious because he felt deceived, as yesterday at the art gallery exhibition, Lysol had introduced herself as Ambiel. The young man then suspected that Lysol was a con artist who deliberately approached him to swindle his wealth.
내 전화번호 어떻게 알고?
그까짓 거 아는 게 뭐 어려워?
Hyun, who had previously been friendly, suddenly became arrogant and full of suspicion. His visit, which promised a high payment, was enthusiastically welcomed by Lysol, especially when Hyun decided to stay for a few days to ensure the girl's identity. Feeling advantaged, Lysol allowed Hyun to stay at her mother's inn, but she charged him 3 times the normal rate. That night, Hyun couldn't sleep well because he kept thinking about Lysol's identity. He suspected that the girl was his grandfather's biological child from a mistress. For a moment, he greeted the girl, who was still engrossed in watching a movie in the yard while enjoying popcorn. Lysol shared that she was adopted from an orphanage when she was 6 years old. To this day, she is waiting for the return of her father, who has been missing for a long time. Hearing this, Hyun promised to reunite her with her father.
내가 도와줄 수도 있는데.
Before they had a chance to negotiate, Hyun persuaded Lysol to quickly depart for Seoul, as the grandfather wanted to meet the princess. Upon arriving at the grandfather's house, the girl was greeted so emotionally that the grandfather immediately knelt before her.
Mama.
While crying, the grandfather then recounted Lysol's origins, revealing that she was actually the great-granddaughter of the emperor. He presented an ancient city that contained images of the late emperor and the crown prince. Before Joseon transitioned into the Republic of Korea, the emperor deliberately sent his son to a foreign land and hid his identity for security reasons. The emperor's descendants lived in misery, while the royal wealth was officially managed by the Dayan group. Based on the emperor's mandate, the grandfather promised that if he were to meet the princess, he would hand over all the wealth, half to the state and the other half to the princess as the rightful owner. Like a dream, Lysol was truly shocked to hear it, especially after learning that her father had passed away, which immediately made her cry and prepare to run away from her grandfather. Hyun tried to chase after her and hug her as Lysol cried. The girl was truly devastated because she was convinced that her father was still alive, as he had promised back then that he would definitely return. After feeling abandoned for 20 years in the orphanage, Lysol was not ready to accept the reality and felt unworthy of being the Lord's daughter. Lysol asked Hyun to take her back to Dana's house, but she was not allowed to enter and felt cold under the falling snow.
다나.
Not wanting to leave the Lord's daughter alone, Hyun offered Lysol to stop by her house and have dinner. In the midst of enjoying their conversation and Hyung's homemade food, they were both startled by the sudden arrival of Yeonku, forcing Lysol to hide in the room.
야.
Lysol felt an unbearable stomachache. She then asked Hyun to quickly take Yeonjo out to avoid any misunderstanding. The girl could no longer endure the stomach pain and had to run out of the room to the toilet before the guests left. Even though he tried to hide it, in the end, Hyun couldn't avoid it when Yeonjo pressed him about why there was a woman's shoe in his house. Unexpectedly, Lysol suddenly walked out of the bathroom and Yeonjo saw her. He strongly suspected that his fiancée was having a special relationship with Lysol. Of course, Hyun suddenly turned pale and couldn't say anything. Yeonjo held back his jealousy and chose to leave, venting his frustration by drinking heavily and embarrassing himself. The two eventually spent the night together, and he chose to forgive Yeonjo's mistake. He was still determined to continue seeking information about the missing imperial descendant. Meanwhile, the news of the princess's return was officially released in various media, but her identity is still kept secret. Grandfather urged Haeng to quickly protect Lysol from media attention. He went to the campus and immediately hugged Lysol, covering her face from the camera flashes. Rumors were inevitable. In the end, Haeng was forced to admit that the girl he brought was his fiancée to stop the media from pursuing them. Haeng eventually managed to drag Lysol into a hotel to avoid the reporter's chase. The girl was confused and briefly thought that Haeng was going to check in with her, and she kept resisting until she accidentally hit his face, causing his nose to bleed. The scandal of Haeng's engagement to the mysterious girl, who was still single, successfully became a hot trending topic, even surpassing the news about the discovery of the goddess. This really made Yeonjul furious and he demanded clarification from Haeng. But what was even more shocking was that he saw Lysol in the same room at the Daein Hotel.
관장님.
To clear up the misunderstanding, Haeng finally revealed the secret that Lysol is the goddess who must be protected from the media. Even Yeonjul, who initially disliked the girl, suddenly became respectful towards her. She was only pretending to be his fiancée in front of the media, to suppress the news of the princess's return. As Haeng's prospective wife, she didn't want her future husband to hand over all the Daein Group's assets to Lysol, who suddenly appeared without knowing the struggles her family went through to build the company. Yeonjul and Haeng eventually made an agreement that they would comply with all of the princess's demands as long as she could receive her rightful share.
한국에서 뜨는 대신 네가 나한테 뭘 얻어내고 싶은지.
Lysol's request wasn't extravagant. She just wanted to be free from the complexities of royal issues and live peacefully abroad to continue her studies. This was immediately granted by Yeonjul, who promised to help her with the immigration documents as soon as possible. Before she had the chance to sign the contract agreement, Lysol was forced to leave immediately to meet her grandfather by taking a private helicopter. It turned out that both of them were visiting the grave of a prince who died 20 years ago. With deep regret, the grandfather apologized to Princess Tuhan because due to his carelessness, the crown prince had an accident, leading to Princess Tuhan disappearing and being abandoned in an orphanage. Lysol could only remember the sad event of her father's departure. This made her resent her grandfather greatly and strive to oppose all his requests.
뭔가 잘못됐어요. 아니라고요.
Mama.
The grandfather realized that everything he held was entirely the princess's and he must protect and return it to her. Under the grandfather's orders, Haeyoung was appointed as the person most responsible for taking care of Lysol and ensuring her safety so that Princess Tuhan wouldn't run away again. Although she could hide her identity from everyone while on campus, Lysol couldn't deny in front of Jungwo that she was Princess Tuhan. Now, even the professor's treatment of her was attentive, even going so far as to escort her home to Danha. The two of them hadn't had the chance to talk more closely because Haeyoung immediately dragged her into the car to keep her safe when reporters came to Danha. Now, even the professor's treatment was no longer evasive. In the end, Haeyoung took Lysol to his mother's inn, which was quite far from Seoul. He also wanted to give a photo of the late crown prince to Lysol to keep as a memento. Their arrival was warmly welcomed by Lysol's adoptive mother, as she thought Haeyoung and her adopted child were a couple looking for a genuine place to relax. She kept teasing Haeyoung and asking how far their relationship had progressed. The mother even intentionally locked them in a room to make things more romantic and less awkward. After seeing the photo of her late father, Lysol suddenly became emotional and expressed her simple hope that she just wanted to continue her studies abroad to be on par with Professor Jungwo, whom she loved dearly. Before deciding to leave, Lysol wrote a farewell letter to her mother without saying goodbye and still hiding her true identity, which made her feel burdened and guilty. She wanted to be a dutiful child, even if just for a moment, by preparing various special dishes, tidying up the house, and doing good deeds to impress her mother. Although sad, Lysol prepared to head to the airport with all her determination. Just as she was about to leave, an immigration officer who knew Lysol's identity suddenly stopped her and forbade her from proceeding. This was because Lysol was the most wanted and protected person by the Korean government, and she was not allowed to leave secretly. It turned out that the one who stopped Lysol from flying to Egypt was her grandfather, who insisted that the Princess of God remain in Korea to fulfill her duties. The girl was already embarrassed because she had sent farewell letters to her mother and her professor. Upon learning the contents of the letter Lysol wrote, which included her plan to escape, her mother was furious and accused Lysol of being pregnant with her boyfriend. However, the girl kept denying it and claimed she just wanted to go on vacation. There was no other way for Hae-young to persuade Lysol's adoptive mother except to confess that they intended to elope because they did not receive her blessing. His identity as the son of a conglomerate was discovered by the mother, and he received full support to leave together. Before leaving, he pretended to act affectionately to deceive the mother so she wouldn't interfere with their plans. Unexpectedly, Lysol's presence on campus was discovered by several journalists, forcing her to run frantically to hide. Hearing the commotion in the media, Hae-young immediately rushed to the campus to protect her. Upon arriving there, he kept scolding Lysol until she refused to go with him, choosing instead to stay with the professor. At this moment, the news about the appointment of the princess has been officially released, so the whole world knows her identity. Even while escaping, the employees at the gas station tried to take pictures of Lysol to document her on social media. Honestly, Hae-young resented Lysol's position because it would threaten all the assets that were supposed to be inherited by him. If he becomes poor, automatically, Young-ko will leave him and their wedding plans will be cancelled, so he is trying to find a way to keep Lysol away from her throne. The young diplomat even threatened his grandfather, saying that he would kidnap and tie up the princess and then throw her far away so that his grandfather couldn't reach her. This made the grandfather furious and worried that his grandson would do something reckless.
너 정신이 제대로 배긴 놈이야!
The council members also spread false news that Crown Prince Makoto is a drunkard who frequently changes partners, and his marriages were never officially recorded by the state. Thus, Lysol is considered not credible enough to hold the position of princess. The plan to take Lysol away to a distant place was a form of threat to the grandfather to ensure his position as the heir remained stable.
내 말 안 듣고 네 맘대로 하고 다니까 그런 일이 생기지.
As they traveled further away from Korea, the two of them took the time to enjoy some culinary delights by the beach. The girl was truly devastated when she heard the sad news about her father being accused of being a traitor to the nation and unworthy of being called a prince. She kept denying it in front of the cafe visitors until Hae-young directly dragged her outside. The girl could only cry on the edge of the beach, recalling the fragment of memory last about her father during his life. In her memory, her life was always in hiding, and even as an adult, she still had to hide because many eyes were targeting her position. The diplomat now stood on the side of those who were not her allies, but rather opponents who wanted to bring her down. Hae-young inflicted a wound on her heart and called her father a pretender to the throne. He asserted that the emperor's son should not hide if he felt he was innocent. In the end, with all his determination, Leeser decided to stop hiding from the people and indeed clear his father's name. He wanted to inform the entire nation that his father had never done what he was accused of.
그거 다 거짓말이에요. 내가 다 바로잡을 거예요.
Amid their conversation, a young shopkeeper suddenly arrived, announcing that a group of people was looking for Leeser. It turned out that the ones who came were her grandfather along with bodyguards ready to escort the princess to the palace. The girl was now officially placed in a luxurious palace and welcomed by dozens of attendants ready to serve her. It felt like a dream. Hellisol was now in a magnificent palace built especially for her. She was served by dozens of servants, and anything she desired could be granted as soon as she wished. However, when the princess took her place in the palace, at the same time, Hae-young had to lose everything. Now all the facilities he had enjoyed so far had to be confiscated by the government because the assets had been transferred to the name of the royal family. Even the shoes he was wearing were not spared from confiscation. Everything was the complete opposite of before. Lysol was looking for the princess while Hae-young suddenly became destitute. He was looking for a way to keep his facilities and threatened to soon announce his marriage to the princess.
그냥 너랑 결혼하려고.
결혼?
Lysol, who heard the threat, felt indignant and reported it to Professor Jangwo. Finally, the girl asked the professor to take her away to a safe place so she wouldn't have to meet Hae-young again. But when the two of them intended to escape, they were caught by Kakaganji, who tried to chase them on the highway. Jangwo lost focus, and the car he was driving crashed into a road repair project barrier. Lysol was injured and had to be rushed to the hospital. While under care, Hae-young and Jang-woo competed to be the one responsible for the patient, but in the end, Jang-woo was forced to give in and let Hae-young take care of the girl.
So?
Even though her condition was not yet stable and she had only recently received medical treatment, Lysol decided to leave the hospital. This was because she had to give up her room for a young child patient who had run out of space. But who would have thought, before going home, Lysol suddenly collapsed unconscious by the side of the car. Hae-young was truly panicked because he previously thought the girl was just pretending to be sick to avoid him. He immediately took her home and treated and cared for her throughout the night. Because her fever wouldn't go down, Hae-young applied a compress and made sure her condition truly improved. He stayed awake all night by the bedside to take care of the girl. The next morning, Hae-young was still very attentive to her and made her a bowl of warm porridge for breakfast. He even fed Lysol, whose hands were still in pain due to bruising and her shoulder.
됐어요.
Their closeness, however, did not last long. Lysol became furious again after finding a document containing a series of false news about her father. She truly did not expect that Hae-young was actually the main mastermind behind the spread of false news about her father.
거라고 생각하는 거야?
The two of them attacked each other, with Hae-young insisting that he would not let Princess God walk easily and would continue to obstruct her. His method of spreading the news was considered effective in making the public doubt the credibility of the royal family. In the end, Lysol left Hae-young's house feeling emotional, threatening never to forgive him and to sever ties with him. As soon as she stepped out, she was immediately greeted by her grandfather, who intended to take her to meet the president.
대통령님께서 기다리고 계십니다.
Lysol's arrival at the palace was enthusiastically welcomed by the president because he wanted to use the princess's support as a strong background to advance to the next presidential election. He wants to gain public sympathy by treating the royal family well. The girl didn't fully understand what was being conveyed, which was asking her to cooperate as a gesture of gratitude for agreeing to restore the family lineage. That had been forgotten. He wants the princess to study diligently so she can appear elegant as someone who is in the public eye. Not only that, the president personally met with opposition council members and emphasized to them to stop bothering the princess. Meanwhile, Yeonjo, who did not remain silent about the asset confiscation, is now taking steps to retaliate. He volunteered to be placed as the chief director of the royal division. He did all of this to be able to control Lysol so that he could quickly remove him from the hierarchy. His request was immediately accepted by his grandfather because Yeonjo is the only person considered worthy to lead the royal division. Similarly, Hae-young also moved quickly to strategize. Now he approached the president directly and offered himself as the private tutor for the princess. His request was immediately accepted by the president. These two individuals agreed to help each other in overthrowing the princess and becoming true adversaries. After meeting with the president, Lysol, who was exhausted, immediately wanted to rest in her room. However, as she was about to close her eyes, she suddenly remembered Hae-young gently touching her forehead and taking care of her the previous night. The mix of hatred and her body's budding love truly made Lysol feel conflicted. The next day, she was startled by Hae-young's sudden arrival in her room, waking her from her sleep. At first, she thought it was just a dream, but it turned out Hae-young was really in her room and said that he would keep an eye on Lysol for 24 hours.
안녕하십니까, 공주님.
The handsome diplomat, her enemy, now introduced himself to her as the private tutor for the royal family. He boasted that he would discipline the princess to make her more disciplined. He also emphasized that he would stay in the palace and monitor the princess's learning progress to ensure it aligns with noble etiquette. On his first day of work, Lysol, who was fed up with him, firmly refused to have Hae-young as her teacher. She argued that this would surely stir up news of their previous scandal. However, in the end, the girl was left with no choice and had to accept it because Hae-young received full support from the president and had met the requirements to become the princess's personal educator.
그래서 두 분이 함께 계셔야 하는 겁니다.
On the other hand, the elder questioned the hidden motives behind why his grandson was willing to take on the task of teaching the princess, when he actually despised her. The young man also emphasized that he did not want to suffer a disgraceful fate like his father and chose to become a servant of the kingdom. He also pleaded for the elder to return his assets as compensation.
귀엽고 그 소리 하셔서 속이 풀리세요?
The initial learning materials provided by Haeyoung were very difficult for Lysol because during college, she was known as a dull student who spent her time in class just admiring the professor. She even received a 0 score, to the point where Haeyoung kept mocking her and threatened to report her to the president. Unwilling to accept Haeyoung's taunts, Lysol tried to snatch the exam papers from the young man's hands and chased him into the room. The two accidentally ended up on top of each other, leaving Lysol flustered and unable to sleep all night. As a result of staying up late, the next morning Lysol was hard to wake up, and eventually, Haeyoung had to carry her and throw her into the pool. Even though Haeyoung's behavior seemed to annoy the princess, at certain moments the two appeared so in sync, like a couple supporting each other. He was very firm in teaching how to elegantly introduce oneself in front of the camera, which would later be featured on various internet channels. He also explained in detail about the royal family's lineage and apologized to the girl for tarnishing her father's good name.
너희 양아버지 기소 사실이 밝혀지겠지.
Meanwhile, not only Haeyoung, who works in the palace, now Yeonjo also has full control over the kingdom's activities, including the official letters of the royal princess family. That woman invited Lysol's adoptive mother and sister and asked them to sign the family separation letter of Angotak. Currently, Lysol has officially been released from the Angotak adoptive family and has been established as the legitimate child of Kdrama Recap without anyone's knowledge. Yeonjo ordered servant Hong to act as a spy to report on Lysol's activities with her fiancé.
이설은 어떻게 지내요? 그게...
Feeling that they had successfully secured an important position in the palace, Haeyoung and Yeonjo took the time to drink wine together as a symbol of celebration for this victory. However, before they had a chance to chat, Yeonjo suddenly excused himself because he had a meeting with Jungwoo. In this meeting, the professor admitted that he had been accepted to work as one of the official advisory staff in the vision. With an emotional gaze, he decided to end his romantic relationship with Yeonjo because he was fed up with being treated as a backup man all this time. Besides becoming an advisor, he also wanted to get closer to the princess who had admired him for years.
내 감정 따윈 생각도 안 해봤겠다, 그치?
Jungwoo's recent statement truly made Yeonjo furious and left him speechless. He grew to despise Lysol even more for making Jungwoo turn away. Amidst her busy schedule at the kingdom, Lysol sneaked in time to meet the professor and complain about every unpleasant treatment Haeyoung inflicted on her. Instead of getting angry, the professor actually suggested that Lysol continue to utilize Haeyoung's abilities to improve herself so she would be worthy of being called the princess.
누구나 적의 속마음을 궁금해하지.
The date for the Jumpa press event for the official introduction of the princess to the public will be held in the coming days. Several renowned designers have been brought in to design clothing for the princess. And it turns out that the person responsible for organizing the Jumpa press event is Yeonjo, as the chief director in the kingdom's vision. Before the princess chose her attire, she secretly invited him for a private conversation, with only resentment and hatred in her heart. Yeonjo openly expressed that he would continue to find any way to bring Lysol down from her position. He even threatened to make the girl hated by the entire Korean populace.
조만간 궁에서 나가야 되지 않겠어요?
Hearing this, Lysol suddenly turned pale and was stunned, but she tried to remain calm and strong, hiding her inner turmoil. Not only did he stir up hostility, but Yeonjo even began to openly criticize Lysol in front of the designers, saying she was unworthy of wearing elegant clothes and more suited to simple attire, as it reflected her background of having lived in an orphanage.
고아의 입양아 이미지를 떠올릴 수 있는 컨셉은 피해주세요.
Baeong did not defend the hurt Lysol at all. Instead, he further pressured the girl and emphasized that a princess must not be weak, just because of someone's ridicule, as she would eventually face much stronger enemies.
오늘이 그릴 만큼 더 많이, 더 자주 아플 거라고.
As the trusted director of the kingdom, Yeonjo increasingly gained full control over the princess's activities, including taking her to a spa. That night, Lysol hid in an antique car because she wanted to vent her anger at Yeonjo and Haeyoung.
박혜영, 너 때문이다. 오윤주!
The entire staff thought she had disappeared, and they frantically searched for her, but it was Haeyoung who managed to find her. It turned out that the girl was practicing to become a strong woman like the antagonist in a grand drama, so she could defeat the enemies around her. She admitted that she really hated Haeyoung as her enemy, but her heart kept resisting. Even though the two seemed like sworn enemies, after a while, they started caring for each other like a couple. Lysol even brought milk to Haeyoung's room so she could sleep with him.
대한민국의 공주님께서 하사하는 따끈한 우유니라.
The next day, to clear the prince's name, Lysol's adoptive mother and brother were invited to the palace to negotiate about the case of the stolen artifact that was blamed on the prince, even though the real culprit was her adoptive father. Haeyoung suggested that Lysol sacrifice her adoptive father, who had been involved in a criminal case, to restore the prince's reputation. However, this was strongly opposed by Dan-ha, who was so cruel and kept intimidating her sister, saying she would never forgive Lysol if the bad news about their father spread in the media.
우리 아빠 전과자다. 그거 팔아서 니네 친아빠 누명 먹기려고.
As a child who had been cared for over 20 years, Lysol felt torn between choosing her adoptive father or her biological father. However, Haeyoung kept urging her to choose her biological father because his name would be recorded in history, while her adoptive father was just an ordinary citizen. The girl was really confused about making a choice and could only burn all the evidence related to her adoptive father's case, who had sold all the royal relics. On her first day working at the palace, Lysol invited Jungwoo to eat together as a welcoming gesture. She was very happy because she could freely share her complaints with the professor who was nearby. However, at the same dining table, Haeyoung and Yeonju were already sitting together, which changed the atmosphere to become awkward. During the meal, Jungwoo openly showed his attention to Lysol, and that naturally sparked Yeonju's jealousy. The closeness between the two and the expressive demeanor of the princess, Jungwoo's superior, made Yeonju furious, and she sneered at her behavior, which she considered impolite. After a long time of keeping the secret about the feud between Haeyoung's grandfather and father, Mr. Oakin now revealed the real reason why the grandfather disinherited his father. For a long time, Haeyoung's father was known to be very ambitious and would do anything to remove the crown prince from the ownership of the company. Even when the prince was hiding in a remote area working as a laborer, his life was never peaceful because he kept receiving death threats. The grandfather didn't want the prince to be harmed and chose to disown his son. Now the grandfather doesn't want this to happen to Haeyoung and Princess Lysol.
네가 회장님의 뜻을 따라줬으면 해서 하는 말이야.
Hearing the bitter truth about his father made Haeyoung truly furious, and he threw everything in front of him as a form of venting. His heart was filled with confusion, torn between hatred, sympathy, and the love he had developed for Lysol. He did not want to suffer the same fate as his father, but he also wanted to reclaim his wealth, which was now entirely in the name of Princess Lysol. The next morning, Haeyoung secretly took Lysol to a bay. He wanted to find someone who once knew the crown prince. It turned out that when they were children, Lysol and the prince had lived there while escaping from her father's pursuit. The owner of the rental house still kept old photos and recounted his meeting with the prince, who always seemed fearful and wanted to protect his son.
고생 많이 했다.
As a form of happiness for finding someone who knew her father, that night Lysol asked Haeyoung to join her for soju and seafood at a beachside tavern. However, because she was afraid of drinking, Lysol ended up getting very drunk and staggered around until Haeyoung had to carry her. The girl kept rambling and expressed her hatred towards Haeyoung. She was confused by the diplomat's behavior, who sometimes acted like an enemy, but on the other hand often helped her like a protective guardian. When they reached a staircase, Lysol asked Haeyoung to tie her shoelaces that had come undone. In her heavily intoxicated state, unexpectedly, she suddenly planted a kiss on Haeyoung's cheek, making his heart race. Not wanting to be outdone, the diplomat returned the sweet kiss on Lysol's lips and asked her to forget about what happened tonight. Lysol was suddenly surprised to be kissed by Haeyoung, and the young man then laid her down in the inn and left her alone. Until the next morning, Lysol was visited by a bodyguard who intentionally came to remind her to attend the press conference today. All of that was actually planned by Haeyoung so that Lysol wouldn't interfere with his clarification regarding the prince's case.
내가 너 버렸어.
In front of all the members present, Haeyoung apologized for the absence of Lady Princess. Due to her unwell condition, he emphasized that his statement was meant to represent Lady Princess, and at the same time, he wanted to refute the news about the theft committed by the prince. In addition, he also explained that his relationship with the princess was not a romantic one, but rather a relationship between a student and a teacher. Haeyoung's statement just now truly left the grandfather and Yeonju astonished. After the event, he admitted to the grandfather that he had to do it because he is a loyal subject of the kingdom. However, there was a different story with what Haeyoung said to Lord Oh. He threatened that he would not let the princess walk away easily and would obstruct her just like I did. No one knows what Haeyoung was thinking. He appeared confusing in the eyes of his opponents.
제가 어떤 선택을 했는지 아직 모르시잖아요.
To satisfy his curiosity, Yeonju grilled Haeyoung about her separation from the prince. He even suspected that his fiancée was starting to fall for Lysol. However, Haeyoung denied it and claimed that she did it only to protect her assets from being taken again. Meanwhile, due to the spread of the clarification about the theft committed by his adoptive father, Lysol was ostracized by his family.
서리가 우리 배신했어요.
Upon returning from the bay, before heading to the palace, he visited his mother at the inn to beg for forgiveness. Even though he kept shouting and crying, his mother and sister refused to show themselves because they were already too ashamed. When Junggo arrived to pick him up, Lysol could only cry and express his frustration. He thought, if he had to lose the trust of his adoptive family, it was in order to become a princess. With encouragement, Junggo advised him that tomorrow there would be many obstacles in his life as a princess, and Lysol must not act weak. He assured him that the clarification was necessary to set the record straight about the prince's good history.
차에서 내려서 가족한테 돌아갈 수도 있고.
Upon arriving at the palace, Junggo had a confrontation with Haeyoung because the clarification left Lysol frustrated and estranged from his family. Instead of feeling guilty, Haeyoung turned to attack Junggo, saying he shouldn't be concerned about Masaswina because now Lysol has become his private student. Hearing that, Junggo was not intimidated at all. He was determined to continue protecting the princess until the end of his days. For him, Lysol was not just an ordinary student, but a living historical record and an obsession he had pursued for 10 years.
서린, 나한테 제자가 이상이야.
That night, Lysol vented her anger on Haeyoung because she was disappointed at being left behind just like that. She was also devastated because she was ostracized by her own family. However, with a cold and emotional gaze, Haeyoung only made her sadder. The young man mocked, saying that Lysol's sacrifice of losing her foster family was nothing compared to the status he would gain. The girl cried in front of the room, and the diplomat just let her suffer alone. The next morning, Lysol felt even more restricted because Yeonjuk tightened the supervision. Now everything the princess did had to go through his approval as the director. He claimed that this supervision was to prevent the princess from escaping without the knowledge of the royal staff.
있으면 솔직하게 얘기해보세요.
Unwilling to be treated like a prisoner, Lysol asked all the staff to gather. While standing on a chair, she asserted that she would hold a press conference the next day and announce the legality of her position as a Joseon princess. Lysol promised to deliver a good speech and asked for the staff's guidance.
기자회견에 불참한 것도
Afterwards, the core staff, including Yeonjuk, Haeyoung, and Kanggu, held a meeting with the princess to discuss the material to be presented at the press conference. To undermine Lysol's confidence, Yeonju corrected her speech notes and laughed at her in front of everyone. However, it turned out that Haeyoung and Kanggu defended her that night, and forbade Yeonju from being too harsh in criticizing the princess, who was still a novice. Without anyone's knowledge, Lysol began deleting her blog that was once registered on the entertainment site to avoid tarnishing her image. However, she found it difficult to delete it because the posts were locked after the writer received payment. In the end, Haeyoung, who caught her hiding, immediately took action to delete the silly writings from several online tabloids.
역시 외국 사이트 야동도 봐?
On the other hand, the grandfather was truly furious after hearing about his grandson's departure with the princess and their stay at a bay. To prevent any unwanted incidents, the grandfather invited Haeyoung, Lysol, and Yeonju to dine together and urged Haeyoung to marry Yeonju immediately. Hearing the grandfather's command left Lysol very surprised.
그것을 언론에 공표해.
Unexpectedly, Yeonju firmly rejected the grandfather's request, even though Haeyoung accepted it without any objection. Yeonjo reasoned that she would marry Haeyoung not because of an order, but of her own free will.
예쁘게 청혼받아 사고 싶었습니다.
I don't want to keep living under the shadow of orders, so I turned to ask, why did Haeyoung accept the grandfather's orders when previously he had refused them because his assets had been seized? He emphasized that now his feelings of love for Yeoncho Mulakoya have changed after discovering the affair with Yoonwak.
네가 거절당하는 걸 보기 싫었어.
To retaliate for the affair, Haeyoung is still willing to marry, but he must protect Lee-so without being controlled by his partner. Meanwhile, suddenly someone came to the palace and raged at Lee-so. The girl even ransacked the entire room of the princess and even intended to attack her with a weapon. Fortunately, Haeyoung quickly came to defend and forbade her from setting foot in the palace in such an emotional state. Feeling responsible for this chaos, Haeyoung visited Losmen Ibyu and apologized, admitting that it was he who spread the news on his own initiative. He emphasized that Lee-so knew nothing about it and never agreed to it. While Haeyoung was still talking with Ibyu, it turned out that Lee-so was outside, unaware of the diplomat's arrival. From outside the door, he kept pleading for Ibyu and his sister to forgive him.
엄마랑 항상 그랬으니까.
As a spoiled child, he began to pour out his worries to Ibyu, revealing that he had fallen in love with his own enemy. Strangely, however, he was deeply hurt when he heard the news of his enemy's marriage to another girl. After feeling relieved, he hurried back to the palace even though he hadn't met with his mother. But shortly after, he realized that Haeyoung had heard all of his feelings.
어떡해.
Feeling embarrassed, Lee-so eventually intercepted Haeyoung's car but was ignored, so he switched to intercepting a passing truck to chase after her.
너 영화도 안 보냐?
The princess's introduction conference is ready to be held at the palace. Unlike before, today only a handful of reporters came, as the others were not allowed in by Hyunjo. In the middle of her interrupted speech, Haeyoung suggested that the princess continue her speech in the parking lot. So enthusiastic about welcoming the reporters held outside, Lee-so ran barefoot and gave a speech standing on a chair so everyone could hear him.
대한민국 공주 이설입니다.
In front of all the journalists, he emphasized that he still needs to learn a lot to become a princess. He is not hesitant to accept criticism from the public, which can be sent via his email, even though he is inexperienced. He is confident that the staff behind him will support him to become the best. It didn't take long for the speech to successfully capture the attention of thousands of people who declared themselves as his supporters. Even the president was enthusiastic in giving appreciation and asked Haeyoung to be more diligent in educating the princess to become a politician.
전화위복이랄까.
Feeling guilty for having toyed with the princess, Haeyoung took the time amidst his work to visit the outskirts of the crown's cemetery. He regretted frequently hurting the princess, and also apologized for his father's actions in the past. Upon arriving at the palace, when he saw Lysol in pain with her foot, he immediately carried her to her room. Not far from there, Yeonjo witnessed their closeness and realized that Haeyoung had truly turned away. The next morning, Lysol asked Jungwo to take her to the orphanage where she lived before being adopted. She wanted to find her mother's bag, which could serve as a historical artifact. However, upon arriving there, it turned out that Yeonjo had already arrived earlier and was looking for a similar bag to place in the museum. After finishing his business, Yeonjo asked Jungwo to go home first because he wanted to chat with the princess. In a somewhat tense atmosphere, the two tried to act relaxed and friendly, while enjoying soju. To satisfy her curiosity, Lysol asked why Yeonjo was once greedy and wanted two men at the same time.
기가 막혀서 진짜.
She suggested that Yeonjo choose between the professor and Haeyoung so that Lysol could have one of them. However, the selfish Yeonjo remained firm in her stance and was unwilling to let Lysol take either of them. She loved Jungwo with warmth, but she also needed Haeyoung to achieve her ambitions. Because Lysol couldn't accept it and was annoyed by it, Yeonjo boasted again that both men loved her very much and didn't mind being second. She wanted to test them to prove whose love was the deepest. Yeonjo sent a message to the two men to pick her up at the soju bar. In the end, both of them arrived at the same time, and the woman immediately hugged Haeyoung. This scene was truly painful and was witnessed by Lysol and Jungwo.
추운데 안에서 기다리지.
In Yeonju's embrace, Haeyoung affirmed that he would come anytime his fiancée asked. He even held her fingers to assure her that his heart had never turned away. Feeling an unbearable jealousy. While shedding tears, Lysol tried to stop his departure. However, Haeyoung ignored her and still chose Yeonju. Jeannie, the girl, could only cry and vent her heartbreak to Junggu.
피부는 안 와요.
Meanwhile, Danha, who was always envious of Lysol, tried to find a way to bring her down by handing over the Queen Mother's heirloom wallet to Professor Junggu. She claimed the item as her own, even though she had stolen it from her younger sister. After being examined by a history expert, it turned out that the wallet was genuine. Even though it came from Danha, Junggu was convinced that the wallet truly belonged to Lysol. The next day, Lysol was surprised after receiving many gifts and letters from her supporters. Caught up in happiness, she even replied to them one by one and then informed Haeyoung. One of the letter senders was a presidential staff member who expressed love for Sampotri. Caught between embarrassment and disgust in admitting her jealousy, Haeyoung immediately seized the letter and forbade her from playing around. She instructed Lysol to study more diligently about political knowledge and constitutional law. Despite her harsh approach, Haeyoung wanted to emphasize that her current position was not that of an idol, but of a national leader.
사람들한테 네가 대답해줄 수 있는 게 뭔데?
The popularity of Princess Tuhan dominating the news topics made her a target for politicians, including the president and the opposition party council. Through Haeyoung, the president wanted to invite Princess Tuhan to participate in a visit to the orphanage where the princess was raised. By involving Lysol, the president would portray himself as a savior who brings Princess Tuhan into the palace. Haeyoung gently declined, arguing that Princess Tuhan was still too amateur and not ready to be drawn into the political world. Upon arriving at the palace, he forbade Lysol from going anywhere without his permission. He didn't want the girl to be used as a tool in political battles, as it would eventually be dangerous for her safety.
네가 신경 쓸 거 없어.
Not much different. A member of the opposition party council asked Yeonju to persuade Princess Tuhan to support him in the campaign. However, Yeonju couldn't address the politician's request because he needed to get permission from the chairman's grandfather first. Before meeting the chairman, Yeonju greeted his father, who suddenly started talking about the dark secret of the crown prince's death. He was truly shocked after learning that Haeyoung's father had planned the murder of the prince.
공주 아버지를 죽였다고요?
Mr. Oh really couldn't stand seeing Yeonju's actions, who always opposed Princess Tuhan and wanted to stop him. It seems he couldn't bear the thought of Yeonju becoming a traitor and meeting the same fate as Haeyoung's father. At the same time, it turned out that Haeyoung also heard a similar statement from his grandfather that his father was the one who killed the crown prince. This is what has made the grandfather feel guilty all this time and always want to atone for it. In the end, Haeyoung began to understand why he was ordered to become a diplomat instead of the director of the Daehan group. The reason was none other than because the grandfather intended to prepare him as the right hand of the kingdom.
황새 손을 돌아가시게 한 건.
Even though his request was rejected by Haeyoung, the president still made a visit to the orphanage with Princess Tuhan, with Yeonju's approval. The woman agreed because she wanted to embarrass Lysol in front of the media and witness how naive the girl was, unaware that she was only being used as a political tool. Actually, Lysol was really confused and kept questioning why Haeyoung and Yeonju were not aligned in this visit plan. In the end, she took the initiative to invite the orphanage children to visit the palace.
제가 초대했는데 왜요?
뭐?
Once the children from the orphanage and the president's entourage had gathered, Lysol had no idea that the president had actually invited many journalists to discuss his past life in the orphanage. Without proper preparation, he was truly nervous, which prompted Haeyoung to immediately step in to stop the interview in order to protect him. In front of all the journalists, Haeyoung emphasized that the royal family is not affiliated with any political party. He then dragged the girl away and scolded her thoroughly. In his anger, he even called the girl truly stupid and unaware that she had just been used by the president for image building.
너 진짜로 착한 거야? 아니면 생각이 없는 거야?
Unable to say anything after realizing her mistake, Lysol could only cry and lock herself in her room. In truth, Haeyoung felt regretful for often hurting Lysol's feelings with his harsh words. He finally hurried to her room and asked her to stop ambitiously searching for the princess. He hated having to face Lysol as an enemy because he wanted to make her his lover.
너 공주 안 하면 안 되겠니?
With all her resolve, even though it was difficult for her, Lysol asserted that she couldn't return Haeyoung's feelings and would still become the princess no matter what happened. She couldn't possibly return the feelings of a man who lost his inheritance because of her presence.
대답 안 할 거야.
Hearing that, Haeyoung felt relieved because he felt he had successfully taught the princess to be a firm woman who wouldn't easily be swayed by a man. The next day, the news about Haeyoung's rejection of the president's visit to the palace had spread widely across all media. The president was truly furious and considered Haeyoung a traitor for obstructing his plans. To use the princess as a political tool, he punished Haeyoung by dismissing him from his position at the palace.
근데 그걸 자네가 다 막쳐놨어.
Additionally, the president also emphasized that if Haeyoung continued to protect the princess, he would not only be fired from his job as a diplomat, but the president also threatened to organize massive demonstrations to overthrow the princess. Feeling worried about the president's threat, Haeyoung decided to take a leave of absence for some time and promised to quit his job as the princess's tutor. He intended to go to New York to find his father, who was stranded there, as he had been banned from entering Korea all this time. Before leaving, Haeyoung deliberately did not say goodbye to Lysol because he didn't want to make her sad or feel guilty. He just wanted to invite her to eat together and take a walk for a change. Feeling nervous after rejecting his love, Lysol kept trying to avoid him. The princess even chose to go to the mall where her friend worked and hid inside a suitcase so that Haeyoung wouldn't find her.
나 들키면 나 죽어. 얼른 잠궈.
No matter how well she hid, Haeyoung managed to find her after buying the suitcase, where the princess was hiding. The two of them then took a walk in the ancient Joseon palace, where they first met. All the visitors who saw the princess immediately scrambled to take photos with her. Not wanting to miss the opportunity, Haeyoung also wanted to take a photo to capture the memories. Haeyoung submitted her resignation letter in the princess's room. She also invited her adoptive mother to come to the palace to cheer her up.
엄마가 미안해.
After Haeyoung officially resigned, the princess was now visited by a new teacher from the diplomatic community. Meanwhile, Yeonju, who kept trying to get rid of Lysol, then invited Leiden to collaborate in overthrowing the princess from her throne. With evidence of the authenticity of the wallet left by the Joseon queen, which she claimed as her own, Leiden, who was always envious of her adoptive sister, intended to replace Lysol's position and declare herself as the princess in front of everyone.
고아인 제게 부모님께서 남기신 유일한 유품입니다.
Leiden's arrival at the palace immediately shocked the entire family, causing Haeyoung to have to cancel his departure to America. Following Yeonju's orders, Leiden recounted his life, which was exactly like in Aomili's soul, and he pretended, as if he were the princess of the crown prince who was always fleeing from enemies. Even the grandfather was astonished to hear it, after Leiden mentioned that Haeyoung's father was closely related to the departure of the crown prince. The account from his adoptive brother truly shocked Lysol to the core, because during his childhood he experienced amnesia and didn't remember anything about Haeyoung's father. After successfully shocking the palace, Yeonju continued to spread the news across all media regarding Princess Lysol's status, which could not yet be fully recognized. Because for him, Leiden was more deserving and convincing to be called princess, Yeonju was determined to do whatever it took to remove Lysol. Leiden's statement in front of everyone made the grandfather truly furious. The grandfather accused Haeyoung of being the mastermind who instructed her to falsely claim to be the princess in order to undermine Lysol.
네 놈이 아니면 이런 짓을 꾸민 인사가 누가 있어?
Without denying it, Haeyoung admitted that she indeed wanted to undermine Lysol. The relentless pressure that Yeonju exerted on Lysol became increasingly outrageous, causing Jonggu to be concerned for her safety. He pleaded with his former lover to stop hurting the princess, but Yeonju was not intimidated by this request and insisted that Lysol must leave Korea first. He wanted Lysol to cry in regret and step down from the throne. All this time, Lysol has been the biggest obstacle in his pursuit of ambition.
중요한 건 황실이 흔들린다는 거지.
On the other hand, after hearing that Haeun's father was connected to her own father, Lysol wanted to confirm the truth with Yeonju. In the end, Yeonju explained everything, revealing that Haeung's father was responsible for the death of the city's leader. He emphasized that his son was not much different and would find a way to eliminate the princess. Before it was too late, Yeonju advised her to step down from the throne and go abroad. Upon learning this fact, Lysol was truly shocked and now looked at Haeung with a different gaze, one filled with hatred.
말이 맞아요. 말씀하세요, 공주님.
Lysol was caught in a dilemma, torn between love and the resentment in her heart about what happened to her father in the past. She couldn't easily believe that Haeung, who had always supported her, would act like her father because of a power struggle. Being a princess was not an easy task for her. Before one problem was resolved, another would come along.
때문에 많이 놀라서요.
After the tongue discovered the queen's heirloom wallet, the community became disappointed with Lysol and spread hate speech, accusing her of being a fraud who falsely claimed to be a princess. Various derogatory comments flooded the media, prompting Haeung to advise her to publish her childhood photos from when the royal family was still alive. However, it turns out Lysol hasn't agreed to it yet, as she is worried her adoptive brother will be imprisoned. Even when cornered, Lysol still wants to protect her brother who has been cruel to her.
그럼 우리 언니는요? 언니는 어떻게 되는 건데요?
What else can she do? The only option for her is to keep her promise to Yeonju and be willing to leave the palace. However, she doesn't want to leave forever, but only temporarily to seek the truth about her father's death, which is also related to Haeung's father. After packing all her belongings, Lysol threatened Yeonju that she would definitely return and prove the truth. She is convinced that Yeonju deliberately sowed discord between her and Haeung because he didn't like the diplomat's faction continuously siding with her.
공주 못하겠다는 것도.
While pulling her suitcase, the princess began to move to gather information about anyone who had known her father. This included a homeowner near the beach where her father used to work as a fisherman. From the homeowner's account, he recalled that the crown prince decided to move away from the fishing village because there was a wealthy man who constantly threatened him. Unfortunately, the homeowner did not know the exact identity of the man who was pursuing the crown prince.
니랑 네 아버지랑 우리한테 아무 말도 없이.
Not wanting to give up, Lysol turned to the police station and inquired about anyone who knew her father before he was declared dead in the accident. However, at that time, the results were nil, as the police could not provide a clear statement about the perpetrator who hit the crown prince. Too late, there were influential people who cleared his name. After that, Lysol continued by contacting the Dahan Group Information Center operator to request phone numbers of people who knew her father. Even though she contacted a related number, it turned out that no one could provide a definite answer regarding the relationship between her father and Haeung's father.
정말이세요? 정말 저희 아빠를 아세요?
Not much different. Haeung also tried to find his father's whereabouts by repeatedly calling his phone contacts. Unfortunately, his father never answered those calls. Caught between disappointment, emotions, and anger, Haeung couldn't accept the reality that his father was a murderer. He wanted to ask for clarification directly so that the hostility wouldn't repeat between him and Lysol.
제발 대답 좀 해주라고요. 대답 좀 하시라고요.
Hearing the news that Lysol had fled from the palace, Haeung tried to find him in several places, including his foster mother's inn and his friend's office, but Mr. Putrita was there. He then turned to meet Leiden and persuaded him to admit his mistake. He emphasized that Lysol was willing to give in and leave the palace for his sake. However, Leiden completely ignored Haeung and trusted Yeonju more, who promised to send him abroad if the situation worsened.
넌 머리도 나쁜 게 말까지 많구나.
Haeung, becoming increasingly desperate, was forced to invite Yeonju to his home to inquire about the princess's whereabouts. With a feeling of irritation, Yeonju admitted that he deliberately drove her out of the palace so she wouldn't disturb his peaceful life with Haeung. In the end, Haeung moved to find Lysol at a cafe. It turned out the princess was trying to escape from the cafe patrons who caught her napping. In her panic, Lysol even bumped into a patron and accidentally spilled coffee, which led to her being insulted. To protect Lysol from the crowd of patrons, after paying for the spilled coffee, Hae-young then dragged her away and took her to Prof. Jung-wo's house, because it was the only place safe from Yeonju's pursuit. It turned out, Hae-young's assumption was completely wrong. Even though they were already at Prof. Jung-wo's house, Yeonju was still trying to chase Lysol, claiming that he wanted to take her to meet the president's grandfather. Yeonju wanted Lysol to confess in front of the grandfather that she intentionally ran away from the palace and would never return there again.
네 입으로 직접 얘기해. 공주 안 하겠다고.
Before Lysol agreed to Yeonju's request, Hae-young suddenly and unexpectedly intervened and firmly asserted that he would never allow the princess to go with Yeonju. He suddenly pulled her away and took her to a villa quite far from Seoul. Unexpectedly, it turned out that Hae-young brought Lysol to visit the residence of Mr. Park Tae-jun, who was none other than his father. Hae-young apparently deliberately brought her to that place, in order to find some clarity about his father's whereabouts. The villa they visited turned out to hold many memories for Lysol. The princess vaguely remembered that Hae-young's father came out the door and welcomed her. At least at the villa, the two appeared so affectionate as a couple deeply in love. The two embraced each other facing the campfire at night. When the weather was so cold, until the next morning, Hae-young tidied Lysol's messy hair with a strawberry hair tie, the last gift from her father. However, all their happiness instantly faded when Lysol received a call from Mr. Park Tae-jun, who begged her to kill the grandfather to allow him to return to Korea. Upon hearing Hae-young's father's voice, Lysol was truly shocked and immediately asked for clarification regarding her father's death.
말씀해 주세요.
Mr. Tae-jun firmly denied the matter, but he admitted to regretting his actions that always caused trouble for the crown. Slowly, memories of his childhood resurfaced, and he clearly remembered when his father asked him to stay at the villa after his father was declared deceased. He was truly disappointed and decided to leave on his own and complain to his grandfather. As soon as the princess arrived at the president's residence, the grandfather immediately apologized profusely for the unavoidable death of the crown prince. He admitted that the cause of all this chaos was the struggle for power and the grandfather's unfairness towards his son.
이 죄 많은 여신을 죽여주시옵소서.
Because she didn't want the same thing to happen, Lysol insisted that she would not want to become a princess and would prefer to live peacefully with her simple adoptive mother. If the grandfather continued to insist on making her a princess, it would eventually have fatal consequences for her and Hae-young. Hearing the princess's statement, the grandfather was truly shocked and couldn't bear it, leading him to faint and be rushed to the hospital. Although he went through critical times, the grandfather eventually regained consciousness and continued to plead for Yeonju and his father to immediately bring the princess back to the palace. Upon learning that the grandfather had regained consciousness and was still looking for her, Lysol remained firm in her decision to return to her mother.
왜 그렇게 연락이 안 돼?
On the other hand, Hae-young felt truly pressured after Lysol discovered the truth of the secret, and he also felt guilty for being the reason the city prince ran away. Before Lysol left, Hae-young tried to convince her that he was different from his father and would always support Lysol, not wanting to destroy her. However, Lysol ignored him and wanted to return to her adoptive mother. Meanwhile, Jung-gu unexpectedly revealed astonishing news to Yeonju that the historical wallet brought by Leiden was actually a fake wallet created by his adoptive father.
진짠 제게 있습니다 하고 말씀드렸습니다.
The professor deliberately deceived Yeonju and Leiden because he wanted his lover to stop bothering the princess and resign from his position as the executive director of the Palace Foundation. Before Leiden was arrested by the police, Yeonju gave him a sum of hush money and provided him with a ticket to travel abroad, to escape. He also prepared a scholarship for him, as long as he remained silent in front of the investigators. But before he could escape, Hae-young managed to stop Leiden and freeze his accounts. Considering his crimes, which are deemed fatal, due to forging historical artifacts and claiming to be the goddess princess, Leiden is now designated as a national fugitive and is banned from flying to any airport. Currently, the self-proclaimed brother of the goddess princess is truly powerless in front of Hae-young. Upon arriving at the inn, Lysol went about his activities as usual. He cleaned the house, prepared food for his mother, and fed the 2 guard dogs in front of the inn. Every time he saw the room that Hae-young once occupied, he felt an overwhelming longing, but he tried to deny his feelings because of the hatred in his heart. Not much different, Hae-young also felt tormented, because Lysol had come to hate him. He went to the inn just to ease his longing, but Lysol, who was fed up, didn't welcome him at all and immediately went inside and locked the door. She completely ignored Hae-young, who kept knocking on the door to apologize. From noon until night, Hae-young was cold outside while waiting for the princess to open the door. Half in despair, the exhausted Hae-young finally cried and shouted outside until Lysol heard him.
24시간 네가 보고 싶은 걸 어떻게 해?
He kept apologizing for his father's mistakes and promised to atone for all his past sins. He was willing to become a slave forever as long as Lysol would forgive him. The diplomat, who had inadvertently fallen in love, now felt he couldn't bear losing Lysol. It didn't matter if he had to lose his entire inheritance, or even his life, as long as the princess was willing to return.
그 재밌는 건 나 포기 못 하겠어.
Honestly, Lysol was touched by Hae-young's plea, but she couldn't bring herself to appear. Before truly leaving, Hae-young shouted and expressed his feelings that he loved Lysol very much. Hearing that expression of feelings, Lysol suddenly opened the door for him, and Hae-young landed a kiss on the princess's lips. After hugging and exchanging emotional farewells, Hae-young insisted on staying at the inn, despite Lysol's continuous objections. His body felt almost frozen from being outside all day, and he wanted Lady God to compress his forehead, but Lysol, who remained cold, kept ignoring his request. The next morning, while they were having breakfast, Hae-young deliberately didn't eat a single bite, hoping to follow so that Lysol would touch and take care of him.
그래서 확 병날 거야.
Honestly, deep down, he was tormented by the hateful stares, and he promised to do anything as long as Lady God returned to her former cheerful self. That night, unexpectedly, Hae-young invited Lysol's friends along with the loyal palace servants to visit the inn, all done so that Lady God wouldn't feel lonely. The joy truly felt real when the inn was visited by many people, and Lady God appeared to smile, momentarily forgetting her suffering. Even laughter, giggles, chuckles, and jokes were heard when the local cook opened Hae-young's phone, which turned out to contain amusing videos about Lady God. While Hae-young and Lysol were happy, it was a different story for Nyeonju, who was engulfed in grief for being accused of making a fatal mistake in falsifying the Queen's heirloom wallet. Yoongbun invited all board members and high-ranking officials to discuss and dismiss him from his position as executive director.
오윤주 이사장이라고 생각합니다.
Yeonju was not allowed to interfere in any matters related to the kingdom and the Dayan group. Everything he did was not out of revenge. He wanted to stop Yeonju's cruel actions towards the princess, which were becoming increasingly outrageous. The next morning, to atone for his family's past mistakes, Hae-young invited journalists to hold a press conference. For him, this was the only way for Lysol to slightly diminish her hatred towards the Dayan group family. His statement in front of the public was truly shocking. Hae-young was the only generation of the Dayan family who dared to admit that his family had made many mistakes against the royal family for personal gain.
상해 임시정부로 전달하는 임무를 수행하셨습니다.
He revealed a big secret that no one knew, that the president director's grandfather had built the Dayan Group company with the wealth belonging to Emperor Leon. In fact, that wealth should have belonged to his descendants. In front of the public, he admitted that his father was once someone who strongly opposed the restoration efforts of the lineage because he didn't want his inheritance to be taken away. However, now, he is so wise in going there to apologize for his family's sins and entrust everything to Lord Potri. He did not forget to ask the public to always protect Lord Potri.
국민 여러분께서 지켜주시길 바랍니다.
Recalling Hae-young's statement in the media, the grandfather lying in the hospital felt truly proud of his grandson's bravery. All this time, the grandfather lived in the shadow of guilt towards the crown prince, and now it is his grandson who is able to atone for it. Hae-young's resilient attitude made the grandfather relieved, to the point where he felt he could now leave the world in peace. Before taking his last breath, the grandfather asked Hae-young to dedicate himself to Lord Potri until the end of his life.
역시 않아도 되는 걸 다 겪게 했으니 말이다.
The grandfather's passing left a deep sorrow for Hae-young and the entire family. Yeonju was no exception, as he vented all the blame for what happened on Lord Potri. He kept blaming Lysol because her presence was considered a disaster. He berated Lysol harshly and said that, if Lysol weren't there, the grandfather and Hae-young's lives would be peaceful.
너만 없었으면 일어나지 않았을 일들이야.
Caught between anger, hatred, and sadness, Lysol also felt guilty because she was burdened. Whether true or not, her presence indeed brought many changes to the Dayan group family. After the grandfather's funeral, Lysol stayed at home in deep contemplation. She eventually returned to the palace at the request of Hae-young and the entire Korean family. This time, she was determined to return not as the oppressed Lady Potri, but as a resilient Lady Potri with authority. The first thing she did was to dismiss Yeonju from his position as museum director. She also removed him from the group's influence to this day. He no longer had anything to be proud of.
감이에요. 앞으로는 그렇게 불릴 일 없을 테니까.
The two men who were always by his side have now switched to supporting the goddess. Unhappy with Lysol's decision, Yeonju approached the opposition party council and sought ways to bring Hae-young's father back to Korea to fight against the kingdom. To address this issue, Hae-young decided to fly to New York to meet his father. Before morning, he bid farewell to Lysol and gifted her a potted plant.
선물이야.
During the months without Hae-young's presence, Lysol became truly bored with her new private tutor. She always looked for the tutor's mistakes to make them uncomfortable because she preferred studying alone. As the nights passed, Lysol felt lonely in the palace without her beloved. After reading a book, she recalled the beautiful memories with Hae-young by the fountain and hoped her lover would suddenly come and carry her like before. Unexpectedly, when the clumsy Lysol almost slipped, she suddenly fell right into Hae-young's arms. The princess and the diplomat truly expressed their pent-up longing after months apart. Honestly, Lysol felt upset for being left without any news. However, she could finally breathe a sigh of relief, seeing her lover return in a happy state, planting kisses on her cheek repeatedly. His purpose in going to America was achieved. He wanted to meet his father and ask him to relinquish his inheritance to the royal family.
만나서 정리해야 될 사람이 있어서.
After meeting Lysol, Hae-young met with the royal family's personal lawyer and immediately handed over the inheritance documents signed by his father. Hae-young then went on to meet Yeonju and asked his former fiancé to truly forget about him. He no longer wanted to be involved in any relationship with that girl, after learning about all the wrongdoings she had committed all this time. Currently, Yeonju is no longer a high-ranking director, but just an ordinary Risol employee starting her career from the bottom.
리조트 사업이 아니라 모델하우스였어요.
Meanwhile, Yeonju's father wanted to arrange a marriage for his daughter with an analyst, but the man ended up mocking Yeonju for her declining career, which no longer shone as it once did. Yeonju has reaped what she sowed, but even though her career is not as bright as it used to be, Jungkook still chose her and declared his love, expressing that he wanted to start their relationship anew. Yeonju had no other choice but to accept his feelings.
이 말 하려고 왔어.
Meanwhile, Hae-young, who has now officially become the main heir of the dynasty, was not yet ready to sign the inheritance transfer agreement to the kingdom. His puzzling attitude left Lysol and Jungkook bewildered. They indeed believed Hae-young was similar to his father, but it turned out that, in fact, Hae-young deliberately hadn't signed the inheritance transfer, because he actually wanted to use his wealth as a tool to garner support from politicians to back Lysol in the approval poll for the restoration of the Joseon kingdom. All this time, the president has been able to serve as the #1 person in Korea, thanks to campaign funds from his grandfather. And now, the opposition party council is approaching Hae-young to secure campaign funding, but Hae-young refuses because the opposition council always opposes the monarchy. Meanwhile, Lysol, who is frustrated because Hae-young has no intention of giving her the inheritance yet, is instead acting out to make him jealous. The princess claims she will meet a wealthy man who proposed to her, which infuriates Hae-young, and he continues to scold her when she is about to study. In the end, Hae-young explains his plan to the princess that he hasn't signed the inheritance transfer yet, only to gain support from the politicians. With an adorable face, he keeps kissing Lysol repeatedly and asks her to refuse proposals from any man.
취소할게. 벌 받으면 되잖아.
In order to learn the ins and outs of the Dayan company that will be his right, Lysol pleads with Yeonju's father, Mr. Oh, to appoint her as the main director of the Royal Foundation. Because all this time, she has dedicated her life to helping her grandfather. Mr. Oh is the only person who can be trusted, even though his daughter is always hostile towards him. 2 days before the election day, Haeyoung officially handed over the entire Dayan family inheritance to the princess, which will later be managed by the foundation and the profits will be donated to the people.
제일 상속자로서 상속 권한을 포기하게 됩니다.
Before the general election began, he wanted to invite Princess God on a date wearing simple clothes without any escort. He wanted to enjoy street food and stroll through the city streets. The inheritance handover was apparently exploited by a problematic journalist to bring down Haeyoung and Lysol. The journalist spread the news that Haeyoung's purpose in handing over the inheritance was a form of money laundering and tax evasion. He also provided a series of evidence that Haeyoung deliberately hid his romantic relationship with the princess to ensure the inheritance remained within his control. The journalist wanted to convince the public that the conglomerate's son and Princess God only wanted to secure their wealth without any intention of contributing to the people. To resolve the complications leading up to the election, Princess God called a number of reporters and clarified that she and Haeyoung truly love each other. And in fact, neither of them had any intention of manipulating the inheritance for their own benefit. With this honesty, she hoped that the public would judge whether the restoration of the royal lineage would receive support or not.
찬성에 투표하라고?
The long-awaited day finally arrived. During the vote counting, Haeyoung escorted the princess to her room so she wouldn't be tense watching the vote count. But suddenly, Jungla came and delivered quite shocking news. Time rolled on. 2 years later, Princess God returned to her campus by bicycle, followed by her bodyguards. Apparently, many things happened over the course of 2 years. Upon returning to campus, Lysol remained a student whose grades had not improved. She resumed studying archaeology under the guidance of Professor Yeonju.
반갑습니다. 오윤주입니다.
Due to personal sentiments, Yeonju often vented his emotions on Lysol while she was on campus. He even gave her an F grade for frequently being absent and instructed her to distribute exam sheets to the other students. Over the past 2 years, it turns out Haeyoung was not in Korea. He was apparently on a national duty serving as a diplomatic representative stationed in London. He did not send any news to the princess, leaving his beloved longing for him. On her 27th birthday, the princess always hoped for a call and a gift from her beloved, but what she awaited never appeared.
안 왔는데요.
Despite her popularity, Lysol received various marriage proposals from foreign nobles, such as those from Thailand and Japan. However, Lysol did not want to respond to any of them, as she deeply missed Haeyoung.
아니요, 해리 왕자님이요.
Even though her academic performance was less than satisfactory, Lysol received strong support from the public. She is now busy filming various commercials for the Cultural Tourism Department. She has successfully introduced Joseon food and culture to people all over the world. Amidst her busy schedule, Lysol still has to learn how to drive and struggles with it, as she has yet to pass the driving test to get her license. In the middle of practice, Haeyoung suddenly came and surprised her, leaving her both shocked and touched. She immediately expressed her longing by hugging her beloved through the car window. After being apart for 2 years, Haeyoung wanted to propose to Lysol right away, but their wedding plans did not receive the president's blessing. For official reasons, the president asked him to serve as one of the UN secretaries in Washington. Honestly, he felt it was difficult to leave Korea because he had just reunited with his beloved. In the end, with a heavy heart, he decided not to give the diamond ring to Lysol. While in Korea, he was busy with various agendas, which led him to set aside his promise to the princess.
미안.
Due to being extremely frustrated by Haeyoung's attitude of certainly and absolutely prioritizing work over her, Lysol ultimately went to the city council office and threatened to end the relationship if Haeyoung didn't soon provide certainty about when he would marry her. She even pretended to cry all day and forbade Haeyoung from entering her room. Finally, Haeyoung persuaded her and promised to find the KSR Leon documents stored in the London Museum. As long as the princess didn't end the relationship, Lysol was overjoyed to hear that Haeyoung promised to return her grandfather's very valuable manuscript. However, it turned out that the London Museum required a meeting with Prof. Yonku before handing over the sabotaged manuscript. What else could be done? Lysol finally asked for help from Yonku as the Prof. of Archaeology to be able to retrieve that historical relic.
오 교수님이 저한테 꼭 필요한 사람이라서요.
Although the two were once at odds with each other, now they have both moved on and opened their hearts to their respective partners. On the other hand, surprising news comes from Lee Dan-hwa, the adoptive sister of the princess who has been living a wandering life without clarity because she fears imprisonment. Directly, Lysol visited her cramped living quarters and was completely convinced of her past crimes. The two of them had a fierce argument, pulling each other's hair, like children fighting over a toy.
내가 그동안 너한테 당했던 거는 다 풀고 갈 거다.
With the princess's generosity, Lee Dan has been released from her fugitive status and allowed to take the civil service exam. She hopes her sister can secure a good career and return to their mother's home. After the KSR Leon documents were officially returned to the Korean Museum, news of Lysol's prowess in tracing her ancestors' history began to spread widely in the media. Now she has allowed people from both domestic and international communities to visit the palace and learn more about the royal family's lineage. As an appreciation for her achievements, Lysol asked Taeyong to give her a definite answer on when he would propose to her. However, it turned out that Haeyoung seemed quite upset because he couldn't marry the princess in the near future. The reason being, he had to go on a business trip to Washington for several years. Upon hearing this, Lysol was truly disappointed and accused Haeyoung of having a lover abroad. Haeyoung firmly denied the accusation and claimed that the ring was only for Lysol. Haeyoung expressed that he wanted to marry Lysol before leaving for Washington and invited her to live there with him.
우리 당장 떠나자 그냥.
However, Lysol refused to go because she still had a lot of work to finish in Korea. The next day, Haeyoung was very hesitant as he was about to depart alone at the airport. Honestly, he hoped Lysol would see him off. And unexpectedly, while sitting on the plane, it turned out Lysol was right next to him and revealed that she would go anywhere to accompany Haeyoung. A gentle kiss landed on his lips, and Lysol returned it with a more passionate kiss. And the film ended.